Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing two of my favorite fantasy authors, George R. R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson. Not only will I be comparing them as authors, I will be looking at their lives and comparing them as people in general. When I first started reading their books in like 2014, 2015, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin and Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson quickly became two of my favorite fantasy series, and still to this day, they are both my number one and number two favorite fantasy series of all time. And when I read these books, I really didn't know who George R. R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson were. I only knew that they were fantasy authors. That's all I knew about them. But like a lot of people who are fans of these series, once you read the books and you're waiting for more of them to come out, you typically, like me, go on YouTube, watch interviews, watch theory videos, the whole works. And once you do that, you start realizing and learning more about these authors, not even who they are as authors, but who they are as people in general. And over the years that I've been reading these series and learning more about these two particular authors, it's really interesting to me how I enjoy both of their works, and yet they're radically different people. So that's really the main point of this video, is to go more in depth about how these two particular authors write, their lifestyles, and yet how someone like me can still manage to love both of their series, despite how different they are. But before I do that, I'll just quickly mention the things that they have in common. Number one, they're both authors. Number two, they're both very famous fantasy authors. And what I mean by that is people who typically read fantasy, and especially epic fantasy. They're very well known. Not a lot of people who read fantasy are unaware of these two authors. Also, another easy comparison between them as fantasy authors is that they both love to write chunky books. You got Storm of Swords here, 1,100 pages. You've got Way of Kings here, 1,200 pages. They love to write. And they're both best-selling authors. George probably more so just because of the TV show. After the TV show, he sold a lot more books. And now we'll jump into some differences. And probably one of the main differences, well, I won't say the main difference, but a pretty noticeable difference is that George R. R. Martin is definitely a lot older than Brandon Sanderson. He's in his 70s. Brandon Sanderson, I believe, is in his 40s. George R. R. Martin's very first published book came out in 1976. And I'd have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure Sanderson, he either wasn't born then or he was extremely young. So as far as being an author goes, George R. R. Martin is definitely more old school. And Brandon Sanderson, while he's not extremely young, his first published book didn't come out until 2005. So he hasn't been writing for very long. And I know a lot of people would probably say, oh, the main difference between George R. R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson is that Sanderson writes very quickly and George R. R. Martin likes to take his time. But in reality, that's not quite fair, because in George's heyday, well, I won't say heyday, but in the 70s and 80s, he wrote fairly quickly. He managed to publish several books. And even when A Song of Ice and Fire was first published, the first book came out in 1996, the second book came out in 1998, the third book came out in either 2000 or 2001, so they were pretty back to back to back. And if you look at Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, each one of those books has 4 or 3 years in between them. So, and Sanderson's still relatively young. I'm not saying he doesn't write fast. He obviously writes fast, and he writes, adult, young adult, middle grade, and all that. All I'm saying is he's still got 6 Stormlight books left to write. And he's not going to get to the second arc until, he's in his 50s, and he'll still be writing it when he's in his 60s. So we'll see what happens then. One of the main differences when it comes to the actual writing process for these two authors is that George is what he would call a gardener, and Brandon Sanderson is more of an architect. And essentially what that means is that George goes into a lot of his works without an outline. He'll have a general premise of what he's going to write, but he'll basically just start writing, and he'll kind of get the feel for the story, and he'll just go and go and go until something clicks. And Sanderson is the exact opposite. Before he begins writing at all, or writing the story rather, he has to outline the whole story beat by beat. This is what's going to happen. And of course, these two different writing styles have their pros and cons, but I think for George, it works better for him that way because his books can be seemingly unpredictable with all of the different character deaths and plot twists that happens. And with Sanderson, what he likes to do is he likes to set up these mysteries in his books, and then by the end of the book, when you realize something big's happened, the hints were there all along. And then another main difference between their writing styles, I would say, is tone. George's writing style is definitely a lot darker. It's more gritty. It's more what people would call grimdark. And a lot of his stories, especially when he wrote sci-fi, but even a little bit with A Song of Ice and Fire, can feel very existential and very nihilistic. With Sanderson, I won't say it's the exact opposite, but once you finish a Sanderson book, more than likely you're going to have a feeling of hopefulness. It's not like the doom and gloom that is A Song of Ice and Fire or the sci-fi he wrote back in the 70s. You're gonna come out of like a Stormlight book or a Mistborn book, and you're gonna feel like a feeling of triumph rather than defeat. And it's interesting because both of their approaches came from what they wanted to read in fantasy. With George, one of the reasons he wanted to tackle A Song of Ice and Fire is because the decades and decades he was reading fantasy, a lot of the fantasy he read as a kid and even into his adulthood, they glorified the medieval ages. Like, oh, wouldn't this time be such a great place to live in? And George was like, hell no. This is why it's bad. This is why you would never want to live here. And so he basically wrote anti-fantasy, where, he takes all these tropes and he's like, look, this would suck if you were stuck in the Middle Ages. Like, this is what it would actually be like. And by doing that, he kind of inspired, I won't say he created, because maybe something like the Black Company did that before him, but he definitely inspired a movement of more grim darkiness, more morally gray characters. He started that movement. And before Brandon Sanderson was published, his thought was that, you know what, I'm kind of sick of reading all of these grim dark fantasies. I want to go back to more classic, where the heroes were good guys and they went on a quest and they had to triumph. I want to go back to that. And so his writing style originated from wanting to stray away from the darker tones of fantasy. While George, he started writing the darker tones of fantasy because he was tired of the more classic feel. And I won't say that Sanderson is copying, classic fantasy. His fantasy books feel like a very good balance between, the classic hero doing good, but you also have, you have morally great characters as well, except it's not something dark like A Song of Ice and Fire or Joe Abercrombie or Mark Lawrence, nothing like that. Another different approach they have to writing is that George loves ambiguity. He loves writing about mystery. and especially in his older works, but you also get it in A Song of Ice and Fire, is he presents a lot of interesting things in these stories, but he leaves you with either a lot or a few questions unanswered. But Sanderson usually doesn't do that. Like when you read Mistborn, for example, if you read the whole trilogy, there's not a lot of unexplained stuff that happens. Everything gets explained. There's no real mystery left. He likes to explain everything. And this works especially so with how these authors approach magic. Obviously, Sanderson is very well known for introducing very detailed and intricate magic systems into his world, almost to the point where they feel like science. George, on the other hand, his magic can go unexplained at times. He won't go into too much detail about necessarily how everything works. All you know is that it's there, it's present, and it's not extremely important to the plot. While Sanderson, on the other hand, you read his books, and if it wasn't explained in Mistborn how everything worked, it wouldn't be a very compelling story, and it wouldn't work. And just from the nature of their writing styles, you get very different things that are in these books. Like for example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, you have tons of graphic, detailed, extreme violence. You have lots of sex scenes. You have lots of nudity. You have tons of swear words. And Sanderson has almost none of that. There is violence. It's not extremely detailed. There's no sex. All of the sex is implied. There's very little nudity and swear words. He will occasionally use one, but a lot of the time Sanderson likes to introduce new swear words that people in these different worlds that he created, those are swear words to them. For example, in Roshar for Stormlight, people say storms all the time, and that's a swear word. Whereas in Song of Ice and Fire, they'll just say And this doesn't necessarily have to do with them as authors. This next thing has just more to do with their everyday lives. George R. Martin considers himself an atheist. He's not a fan of organized religion, while Brandon Sanderson is a devout Mormon. But despite their radical religious differences that they have, they manage to write compelling characters that don't think the same way they do. For example, even though George R. R. Martin is an atheist, in his A Song of Ice and Fire books, he has people that are very faithful and religious, and they're good people. Like you've got Catelyn, you've got Brienne, and you've got Davos. They're all religious, they're all believers in whatever god they want to believe in, and they're pretty much, good, smart people. But then on the flip side, you have Sanderson, who is a devout Mormon, but he's written a very compelling atheist character in Yasna, who is actually one of my favorite Stormlight Archive characters. And basically, by making this video, I just wanted to make the point that no matter who you are as a person, as an author, no matter how you choose to write your stories, no matter what you write about, the important thing is that you write compelling characters. And that's what both of these authors do. They do it very well, and that's why I feel that they are as successful as they are. Both of these authors have pros and cons, things that I love about their writing, things that I don't love so much. But in general, I do love both of these authors. And like I said, George R. R. Martin's my favorite. Brandon Sanderson's my third favorite author. And then there's Stephen King. I'm better than both of them. Anyway, what did you guys think of this video? Did you know these things about George R. R. Martin or Brandon Sanderson? Which author do you prefer? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw here, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.